don't we introduce ourselves and do at least the organizers and do the overview of the schedule?
Okay, sounds good. I'm also putting a message in the chat. Just so, feel free to say whatever you want in the chat, but you can also ask questions here that we'll get back to later in our open discussion session. I'm putting it there now. But, if you want to introduce yourself, rather you can. I'll do that.
Okay. Hello, I'm Bradley Alicea, and I'm the head scientist at the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab. And together with Jesse and Avery, we're hosting this event. This is based on a lot of the work that we've been doing in the lab, and we hope you enjoy it. If you're interested in joining the lab, let us know. Also, we'll be following up on this topic outside this meeting. Enjoy the meeting.
Hey everyone, I'll be on camera after this, but I wanted to kind of just run through this quickly. Well, actually, I'll do it now. I think I can do it. I'm a little bit. Let's see if I can do it like this. Can you see? Here we go. Hello, I'm Jesse. I'm one of the hosts for this event, and I'm the scientist at the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab. We wanted to put together a few different ideas about trends in cognitive science and also where it could be going. So feel free to kind of have some ideas for trends in mind that you might want to talk about later in our discussion session. But just as a heads up, and I'll say this again later when we start officially, we're kind of going to go through a set of presentations, and then we'll have a big open discussion session. So please save your ideas and questions for that time. So we would want to be as much interaction and discussion as possible, but we're going to kind of keep it in one spot until we get through all of our. And then we can just we'll probably go in many different directions and tangents, but that's totally fine. And thanks for stopping by so far. And hello, and I'll be back doing the intro in a few moments, and I'll pass it on to Avery. So
hello, my name is Avery. I'm an undergraduate member of the Orthogonal Research Lab, and I'll be presenting last before our open conversation, and I'll be going over some interesting literature that can lead to, hopefully, some productive conversations in mind for our other presentation.
Okay. Thank you, and we'll, I think I'm sharing my screen again, so we'll wait maybe just one more minute or so. I think we'll pretty much have, I think that's about the people who signed up. So I'll wait just another second and we'll get started. But yeah, just to kind of go over things. Yep, this is the discussion group for Trajectories in Cognitive Science. We just introduced ourselves as the hosts. That's Orthogonal Lab, and I'm going to give you a little bit of our agenda here. You can see I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of Frontier Map, sort of a concept we developed, and Conditioned Futures, what that is, what that project is, and part of in our lab, and what that's been. We've been doing everything with that over the last year or so. So kind of a little bit overview of that. Bradley will give a talk on where things are, on how evolution in different fields of study can occur, and some interesting ideas about that. I feel like I spelled the Jason wrong, but I don't know if I did. It's very tricky. And then we're going to do, I don't think Anusha will be able to join us directly, but we will do a brief review of essentially a paper and some associated discussion about the history of development as a feature or concept in cognitive science. We will have a brief allusion to neurodivergence in cognitive science. We really wanted to have a bigger presentation about this, but one of our collaborators who was going to spearhead that couldn't really be available with that today. So in lieu of that, I'm kind of going to do a very brief overview of a book and a review of a related book. But we really hope to encourage some discussion about that. If you have any personal experience or if you've done any research or interest in that, please discuss that with us in the open discussion session. And just before that open discussion session will be A's talk about some trajectories and a lot of interesting research that they've been looking at and where they're looking to go with some of their ideas and potential paths forward or places that might be some interesting fruit to be picked going ahead. So that's kind of what's on the table, what's on the docket for today. I don't know if we have a lot of time. I would almost like to do just a chance for people to give their own introductions, just so you can say who you are, but I'm not sure. Do you think we have enough time for that, Bradley, or what's your wait on that?
Probably not. Maybe later on if we have time, but I think we should just get into the...
Yeah, we'll get started because we have a lot of things to cover, but please stick around, and we do hope you hear. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put in the chat. If you're not familiar with Gisty, many people maybe aren't, there's a toolbar on the bottom. There's a mic, a camera, sharing a screen, and the closed chat, which is like a comment box or open and closed chat. You can also raise your hand, but we appreciate that mostly to wait until the open discussion session at the end. So thanks for stopping by, and I'll get started with the first talk, which will be an overview of frontier maps and kind of where we came from with this idea. Let's see, can I share my screen this way? I think this is working just fine. Okay, can you see? Oops, nope. I think I'm sharing the wrong thing again. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, I think that will do. All right, you can see that, right? Yes? Okay, great. All right, so a really quick introduction to frontier maps and cognition futures. Frontier map is sort of a concept, and what we'd ultimately like to develop is kind of a skill set. But this is kind of just going to give you a history of how we came about thinking about all this. And some takeaways from this talk is a broad concept of mapping frontiers, some tools for it, and then a specific instantiation of this in the project of mapping cognition futures and the research team at Oral, Orthogonal Research and Education Lab. A little bit of a brief agenda for this talk is, where do you start as someone who's interested in a very broad field like cognitive science or a specific aspect within that field, the need for a map, and how you develop a map, how you develop a sense of where your bearings and how you want to research them. Frontier map itself is essentially aimed to become a tool for researchers and how to, kind of a set of skills or ideas or ways to look at things that help you to develop perspective and historical context and a sense of trajectories in whatever field you want to do. Obviously, this talk and this conference is about cognitive science and kind of fits with cognition futures in general. But the core frontier mapping is sort of applies to any field really, especially for like early career researchers or people just getting into a field. My coming into this came through what happened in cybernetics, because I heard about this term a long time ago and I heard about this term in a very, before I even got into research, I should say, I heard about cybernetics. It's a very interesting term. I started researching it and trying to find out more about it. I saw like a strange YouTube video about it, and it's kind of esoteric in how it's talked about now. And I led to learning a little more about Norbert Wiener and Conrad Ashby and the aggregate regulator theorem, and then tuning information, forces, all these things that kept coming out of it, and eventually cognitive science. But in a lot of things that I found, it was very difficult to find the context. And a friend of mine wrote this tweet earlier this year, basically saying, it's so hard because sometimes textbooks often lack epistemic humility, or they present the development of how ideas came in, but it may not actually be the best way to understand it. So learning through textbook or certain sources can be challenging, especially when they're the only voice you have, and how do you understand, develop, how do you get to these things like trajectories or paths or choices? And I think Bradley's coming to talk will really get into some of the specifics about this, of how are choices made in fields of study and where can they go? and what is causing those choices to happen. Why were the forks in the road made? So that's this is sort of the motivation for the idea of frontier mapping, and even like when you go to conferences like this, or when I first started getting into all of this stuff, and I'm certainly not an expert by any means at this point, but it was sort of like, where do you get the context, and how do you know that you're missing context even? What should you study? And what are the references that are happening in a field of study that you may not be aware of? So these are all sort of things to keep in mind. So for some tools about this, Frontier Map is sort of this collection of ideas that stem from the concept of epistemological directories. This is like a project in our lab for a long time about collecting sort of knowledge maps, collecting some epistemological maps, seeing visualization, things like that. And there's some other tools you may know already, especially for like on the computational side of things, like distill.pub, Papers with Code, Match Library. And state-of-the-art AI is actually a new project that I'm also working with a little bit. They're kind of mapping the trajectory of the evolution of different trajectories in machine learning, basically, and computer science. But again, you may be familiar with things like Distill. This is an example of state-of-the-art AI, where you can kind of get a list of papers and see all these citations for where the papers came from. And you can really do a lot of different things with their website, which I may show more later. But just to keep it rolling here, another inspiration for me for Frontier Map was sort of this talk we gave at a CSV conference last year, and the idea of the minimal relevant information. So what's the least that you need to know to kind of have a grasp of what's actually going on in a field of study? And in a sense, Frontier Map has become an umbrella project for a lot of sub-projects. And building from the epistemological directories and knowledge maps, epistemological maps here, and creating something like a frontier map, which is kind of creating your own map specific to how you want to tag them versus what's important. Your own sort of structure of, here are key players, here are key occurrences, here are question points, and how do you map out a trajectory of influence along a frontier of interest to you, a frontier like in advanced research or a particular line of questioning that suits you. So again, this is kind of the front. This was the Cognition Futures website of the past. It's been a little bit updated since then. But Cognition Futures is essentially a specific frontier map installment of how do we flesh out some understandings of what's happening, in this case, like studies about cognition. And this is an allusion to some of the things which I'll kind of release through here, but the next decade in AI, a lot of our work in the lab in this project caters to making AI, artificial intelligence, more robust, and some developmental roadmaps in that we've fleshed out. We have a survey of computational models of cognition, which dovetails into a little bit of what we'll talk about in a couple presentations from now. And a bunch of other questions. I'm actually going to skip these just to get rolling with our next, all the things we have to do. But understanding where models come from and how the salience of models changes over time and their related taxonomy is a really interesting topic that we're looking at as well. And on for each of these, you know about embodiment and things like that. A shout out to ALEC. We presented some things and submitted things to ALEC in the past, and also Neuromatch Conference. Some of you may know about that. The Academy actually just ended for its computational neuroscience. Just happened this week. A shout out to Embodied Intelligence Workshop, where we presented some of our ideas there. And that will also come again, that will come up quite a bit in the developmental discussion we'll have in a presentation or two from now. And we submitted something to ACM CHI as well. And a thank you to our team. An incomplete picture of our team. Anusha should be here, but thanks to our team. If you know that picture, then great. If not, we'll find out today. All right. And again, there are some opportunities. If you're interested in any of these things, talk to us after actor representations because we have some ongoing projects. But more about that at the end. We'll just get into that for now. And I guess I still have this joke available. Even if you're vaccinated by the CDC, still, oh, I won't show up here. The CDC recommends, this probably isn't going to land very well. The CDC recommends the following. Even if you're fully vaccinated, the CDC recommends finishing your current project before starting 12 new ones. So there you go. That's the joke that this one you can load. That's the joke that we'll close on, and I'll kick it over to Bradley to get on to our next subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. That was very good. Creative ending there. So I want to share my screen here, and I'm going to talk about something maybe people aren't going to get at first, but it's going to become clear by the end of the talk. So let me present. So this is something called adjacent futures, and the idea is how the concept of an adjacent possible can affect the trajectory of an academic field. So we've talked about, the future of any academic field as being a series of choices, and so what drives those choices? Why do people explore the areas that they do, and so forth? So we can start with a couple of quotes. One is from Max Planck, who's now dead, and he was a famous physicist. And he argued that scientific progress proceeds one funeral at a time. And so in some sense, you have these luminary scientists, and they have ideas, and they occupy positions in academic departments. And it's very hard, they won't necessarily change their mind on what is going on, what they sort of embrace as a view. So, if we're talking about rapid scientific progress, it's usually going to come either from the outside of the field or from new people coming in. But this also means, because of the way our institutions are set up, that people have to die off or retire before we see progress. So that's one view. But another view is from Stuart Kauffman, who's still alive, and he is actually the pioneer of this idea, the adjacent possible. And he observes that if such a tiny fraction of the potential diversity of proteins of length 100 have ever felt the sun's warmth, then there is plenty of room for human explorers to roam. And so that's a lot of words basically to say that human discovery, like protein space in biology, is highly combinatorial, and that if you have a significant number of people exploring the world of ideas, that you'll have a lot of innovation. But we have to understand how that gets shaped, and so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to take an aside before I talk about the adjacent possible to think about this idea of serendipity. So I've actually worked in technology transfer for a little bit, and I know a little bit about innovation and how people sort of try to come up with ideas and that sort of thing. So one of the things about serendipity, and this is an example of some serendipity happening right there, people make discoveries, but how do they go about making a discovery? How do they get to that point? So one view is that open search, which is basically just searching whatever, just trying every combination of things, it leads to discovery. But that's kind of a brute force approach, and it's really slow actually to find things that work, and it's really not that efficient, and people usually don't do that. So actually there are two other options, and these include finding a solution through some unexpected path. Like you might be looking for one thing and you might lead to another thing. So you do experiments and you find some interesting thing, and then you design another experiment and you get to some discovery. Or you can do research in one field, and that leads to a discovery in another field. So people have often transplanted ideas across fields to make novel discoveries, and so that's another way to do this. And there's an article on this topic if you're interested. But both of these ideas rely on some sort of underlying complex systems approach, and that's what I'm going to talk about in terms of the adjacent possible. So the adjacent possible is like thinking about discoveries as like this possibility space. And let's think about this very abstractly here. And this possibility space is a large combinatorial space that have discrete probabilities. So each of these squares and these arrows, if you take an arrow from one of these white squares and one of these gray squares, there's a certain probability that you'll do that. And they're connected with, going from one intellectual position to another. And by doing this, and you can see that you have a lot of choices from this white square, you can make these choices and you can end up in a lot of different places. So that's the idea here. It's this possibility space. It's not, doesn't have to be that large, but you can have a lot of combinations that add up together. So, one of the things we're looking for is like a neighbor of a neighbor of a neighbor. And you think about this not in terms of the boxes, but ideas. Like an idea that has order 3 adjacency. So that would be an idea that's linked maybe by papers or some other means. That's a relatively small exploration space, but that leads to a potentially large shift from your initial condition. So it unlocks great complexity, and potentially it unlocks a lot of different ideas. But most of the time, academic fields don't explore this adjacency. But nevertheless, people take trajectories that are based on these, and they have a contingency. So, you start out at one place, you explore a certain path, and you end up in another place. And it looks much different than where you started, but we'll talk about maybe some of the barriers to exploring this space. But basically, when we view innovation and change in fields this way, we get to this idea of adjacent possibilities leading to combinatorial creativity with a history. So you have this history, this contingency between the place you start and the place you end up. And this is a citation on the idea of the adjacent possible. It's called the dynamics of correlated novelties. So this is, if you're interested in this topic, it's a very theoretical exercise. You can read that paper. But there are also other things that we should think about aside from the combinatorial nature of it, and that's two things. One of them is propagation speed. So how fast do people explore adjacent ideas? And here you have someone who starts off here, they move to another square up here, and then that leads to unlocking new possibilities, and then they may go to this square up here, and that leads to still more possibilities. But this doesn't happen at a uniform rate. So you could have people make a quick discovery and then wait maybe 50 years for another discovery. And this, of course, describes a number of fields where you have like these early sort of discoveries, and then they have to wait a long time. And we'll discuss maybe why that is, why you have to wait such a long time for the next step. Or sometimes you get parallel trajectories, or how many different ways do people explore this possibility space. So again, we start with our possibility space. We start with this initial condition. We move up to this square, and then that opens up new possibilities. And then at that point, then maybe you have a group of people, all exploring the same path, but they decide, well, we're going to branch off. We're going to split into two paths. There might be one camp that has one theory and another camp that has another theory. And those, because they have differentiating theories, it leads them in different directions in this possibility space. So you can see that now you have this branching trajectory, and this may explain why you have maybe, intellectual debates within fields. And so we can model that using this approach. But what is a field of study? So we want to think more concretely about what a field of study looks like. And so Jesse mentioned citation networks. And so these are co-citation networks arranged in a network. And in this study here, they actually looked at different references, and they wanted to find something called network communities. So communities are things that are highly connected, parts of a network that share neighbors and are highly connected. And they have different ways of discovering communities and networks. But the thing I wanted to point to here in this study was that they were able to find communities that were sort of defined. Sometimes they defined maybe, coherent fields like cybernetics or systems theory, and sometimes they define things like science. So, you can actually take a top-down view of fields, and you can, if you do in that way, sometimes you can find coherent fields, sometimes you find things that are incoherent, but there's a reason for that sort of coherence or incoherence. And this is another way to look at trajectories is, how do they form these coherent fields? Sometimes, like I said, you have to go outside of the field and bring ideas in. And, there are ways we can understand this process. We can also go to the literature and look at multiple paths forward. So if you're familiar with behavioral and brain sciences, the journal, they often have target articles. And these target articles make some statement. This is a cognitive science relevant article here, Resource Rational Analysis. And so they kind of go into this argument in this paper, and then what they do is they solicit responses to this paper. So you can see all of these here listed, and this is just a subset of the responses. And people will respond to this paper, and you can see that the responses are pretty diverse. So one could take a behavioral and brain sciences article, take the responses, and look at how the responses branch off from the original article. What new ideas are introduced? What sorts of points are being raised? And you'll find, if you do this on your own, you'll find that there are a lot of different paths maybe forward from this paper that, otherwise wouldn't necessarily seem obvious to people. So that's another way to measure it. But in summary, with this part of the talk, adjacency is an interaction between adjacent fields. It could be a citation link or a conversation between colleagues in different non-adjacent fields. So, you might have someone talking between psychology and chemistry. That's not a generally common conversation, but those things can lead to this sort of adjacency. Or sometimes you can cite papers. Sometimes they might be closely related, and sometimes they might be very far apart in the space of ideas. And so those are the ways you can establish adjacency. And what's important here to remember is that ideas only need to be adjacent in some way for the potential exploration of ideas. So that describes how ideas flow across the literature and across fields. But now we're going to talk about how maybe some of those paths can be blocked. And so in this case, we have our grid again. We're going back to the abstract, and we look at the initial condition, which is this white square in the middle. And we can see that if we want to move from that white square, we have all these red squares that are sort of potential barriers to exploration. So it could be some epistemic bias against a pathway. It might not conform to your theoretical thinking. There could be a lack of funding to pursue an idea. You might say, oh, this is a great idea, but I can't pursue it. I don't have the money. You might not have the training. So, some idea might require you to have heavy training in neurochemistry. So if you don't have that, then it's hard to pursue. Then there's also that the potential is not salient to researchers. So something might not be experimentally tractable, or people might not understand what you're talking about. And so those are all barriers to exploration. And so that blocks your paths. So this is why you don't necessarily just see people doing whatever they want, or, going all over the place. Our fields are generally defined by coherent themes, but not necessarily coherent themes. They just tend to go in certain directions. And so this is the idea of constrained trajectories, where people pick the things that are tractable and they move along those paths. And sometimes they get locked into these paths over time. And so this is what it looks like. You have these constrained trajectories, but nevertheless, you still benefit from this adjacency. So there are things that are adjacent that allow for discovery, serendipity, and all these things. So where does this lead? So not only does this sort of stand on its own, but it leads to this sort of phylogenetic approach. And so at the Cultural Evolution Society conference, we gave a talk on the dual inheritance phylogenetic approach to academic fields. And so this is an example of a phylogeny of ideas. So as an academic field evolves, you get these branches that come off. These could be papers, these could be theories. Sometimes they merge together, sometimes they branch off separately, and they form different trajectories, maybe based on different theories or different findings. So they're divergent, convergent, and sometimes they die off. Sometimes a paper gets published and never gets cited. So this is how you can capture this using a graphical model. And people have looked at phylomimetic patterns in science evolution as well. So there's some work in this area. So thank you for your attention, and if you're interested in, we can talk about cognitive futures. We can also talk about cybernetics and our Reconstructing Cybernetics initiative. So thank you for listening. And let me unshare my screen. And now we'll move back on to Jesse, I believe, and he'll be talking about development.
All right. Thank you for that. I think I have this set up here. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. The next segment we're going to have is kind of a review of it's a review of a paper that looks at the place of development in the history of psychology and cognitive science. It's written by Gabriele Airenti, and I worked with Anusha a little bit on this. Alicea couldn't make it, so I'm kind of trying to do a brief overview of things in her stead. And it's quite a involved paper. So I'm going to just, if I do this, can you still see this? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to quickly go through this is sort of an example of following one specific trajectory in a field, or maybe two fields, but about the concept of development. And the agenda for this discussion, to go through the paper as it's given, kind of looking at the foundations of things in psychology, cognitive science, and AI, starting with functionalism and its critiques, where it's come from, and kind of the evolution since then in terms of more recent developments in AI and how there's been a lot of emphasis on robotics and other ways to model embodiment or development. And then specifically, Airenti goes into the study of development, which is the second part of her paper. It's more of a conceptual analysis paper, conceptual analysis paper. And she goes into the debate between Piaget and Chomsky, basically Bruner and the intersectional perspective of early childhood development. She looks at the methodological problems of studying development and kind of, makes some allusions to the future and some computational methods that could help with that. So, Bradley, give me a heads up if, I think I'm going to schedule maybe 10 to 15 minutes for this at most. I kind of want to keep it on the shorter side, but if I seem to be taking too long, let me know, because there's a lot of stuff here.
All right.
So just give me a warning, because I'm going to be deep in this stuff. All right, and let's see. I think someone's unmuted, so I'm going to mute anybody who's not currently muted, just to keep any background noises down. All right, okay, here we go. So, kind of a bit of how it started versus how it's going. Airenti kind of gives us in the front part of our discussion. The primary aim of cognitive science, at least at its outset, was what we could call modeling the adult static mind. And that's kind of what it was in maybe the 50s and stuff on. And now we're in a phase where there's a little bit more understanding about, obviously embodiment and interaction between the agent and the environment and so on. Going back to 1956, George Mueller kind of said it was born on this date and information theory. The assumption was that the newly information science could provide a unifying framework for the study of cognitive systems. So, the cognitive revolution, computer science, cognitive science, this is all, this is the big deal back then. And a lot of it kind of started with representations and functionalism. Functionalism, of course, being the hypothesis that what defines the mind are those features that are independent of its naturalization. And then there's a clear distinction, the idea that representations can be computed. So again, this is at the outset in the 50s about these really representation-heavy functionalist approaches. Even in 1978, the Cognitive Science Committee, the common goal was investigating representational and computational capacities of the mind and structural and functional realization of these capacities in the brain. And this was the goal across all the disciplines of the cognitive sciences. That was kind of the aim. It was about finding these ways to compute and how they related to representations. So, and that was how things started in one sense. There was, critiques of functionalism. The symbol grounding problem comes up, and how can a semantic interpretation of a formal symbol system be made intrinsic to the system? Searle has critiques. How can we replace how can computation as a whole replace a biological organ? Putnam, there were a lot of concerns. Is this just behaviorism being revisited? is this really getting us to where we need to be? There were critiques along the lines of, is this anti-mentalism? Is this, it kind of comes out as one of the heroes of Arente's paper here, so just as a spoiler. But Bruner was like, oh, is this abandoning meaning making, which was central concern to on his take, the cognitive revolution. And again, early cognitive science at the outset was about constructing these computational models of human inference processes, the knowledge that it used before these inferences. The primary aim was to find the adult static mind. There wasn't really necessarily a lot about learning or a lot about childhood or development. It was just the adult static mind. How do you replicate this? How do we have computations that do this? That was kind of the idea at the outset. Where was learning and development? There was this backlash because of trying to get over behavioralism, which was controversial and kind of looked down upon and put down, and not really something we want to get into again. And there were also philosophical reasons with Chomsky and Froese. And Froese went so far to explicitly state there was no theory of development. And I note here, for those who know radical embodied cognition, Tony Shamero, in the preface, he wrote, Jerry Froese is one of my favorite philosophers, but I think he's wrong about nearly everything. And we won't go deep into radical embodied cognition, but as many of you probably know, it is essentially anti-representation, and a lot of it's evolutionary psychology and Gibsonian information stuff. So early cognitive science was very much discrete. Reaction to behaviorism, legitimacy of the use of methodologies developed within artificial intelligence, or what was AI back at the time. And the idea was to make explicit how mental representations happen or could be computed. But this reinforced the separation between the mind from its biological basis, and also the context in which human activity takes place. And there was very little place for development. And this is kind of Arente's look at the background, and then kind of saying, well, in the 21st century, at the turn of the century, in the 90s, things maybe move past these original fixations on computation and representation. But as a quick note, and don't have time to go into this, but Froese's timeline, this is just another way to give you a little visualization about things. Computationalism, Connectionism, Enactive and Embodied, Neurophenomenology with Varela, we'll get to that. Generative neurophenomenology. And again, we won't be going into this, but I just want to give a slightly alternative viewpoint about development. But back to Arenti's paper. Connection and computation and learning. In the late 80s and 90s, yes, Hinton, the father of deep learning, of machine learning in these neural net ways, some say godfather, increased importance assumed by learning. Okay. There was still quite a bit of debate, even with connectionist models, about how can neural networks mirror or not the functioning of the brain. Should they try? A lot of philosophical discussions and debates about that as well. Networks are efficient computational tools in some domains and often jointly used with symbolic computations. And Avery will kind of be speaking about this actually in terms of a much more futuristic point of view in 2020 and beyond with their talk later. But this is kind of looking at the turn of the century right now in this timeline. Artificial intelligence, Airenti kind of looks at how AI, as it was back then, which is quite an interesting term anyway. Originally, there was this, the marriage between AI and cognitive science or parts of psychology where, okay, great, AI expected from psychology the analysis of high-level mental mechanisms that once simulated in a computer could improve the efficiency of artificial systems. And with computer simulation, psychology would be able to acquire a method to validate its models. And that that was the thing. You know, how do we computationally get validation and make our stuff more scientific? But Airenti believes this was essentially a failed marriage ultimately, in that it didn't really get to generate what they wanted to. It didn't really achieve what both parties really wanted to achieve. And AI kind of went its own way, using a lot of statistics and machine learning. And in psychology, there was, as kind of Bradley alluded to, there was a little bit of constraint about trying to produce computationally viable models, and that kind of restricted its scope. So again, that's something to think about in terms of how development has happened, and also how trying to fit certain techniques or methods will constrain the development of any field of study. So an interesting note about that. Oops, okay. Enter Varela and the Embodied Mind, of course. 1991 was the big landmark work about, aspirations all the way back to Merleau-Ponty, if I can never say his name right, Buddhism, phenomenology, and there being something more than just a totally discrete mind and no connection to the body. So that's that Airenti did point this out, and she also and part of where Airenti is going with her work is an interesting relationship to artificial intelligence and then robotics in the 21st century. And she suggests that there's a major kind of transition from the role that AI used to play, and now robotics, or developmental robotics. And I'm kind of highlighting over here the international workshop on embodied intelligence. Also, Bradley, how am I doing with time?
You're at 3:45, or 45 after the hour.
Okay, and is that how much time do you think I have left for this?
You can go another 10 to 15 minutes, I think.
Okay, great. Sorry. So to go back to this, let's skip this. So basically, Airenti is kind of saying how robotics has kind of become the domain within which what used to be AI, sort of like going back to that concept of the marriage as AI will give us computational viability. Robotics has seemingly maybe taken that over a bit more because of its focus on embodiment, because of even things like social robotics and the ability to create these more embodied agent examples that have to deal with an environment, have to deal with things like that. And it leads to some of these questions about, can robots be endowed with intentionality, emotions, empathy, and so on. So again, it's kind of and we'll revisit this a little bit more later, but Airenti is kind of saying, the future for these studies is potentially more in aspects of robotics and seeing how that can develop. And she'll go into that in a bit. And this is something we can discuss later. Airenti kind of concludes about this part of her discussion that cognitive science was born to kind of renew psychology through AI, but it maybe didn't work out that way, and that social robotics or aspects of embodiment are best modeled through other things rather than totally isolated computational models. But there are still philosophical problems that remain in the sense of how do we deal with the biological aspects of it. And more about this to come. So the study of development is basically the second half of the paper, and outside of that kind of broader historical background where, the world went tour through 60 years of attempting different things, the study of development kind of has to do with looking at some key points of actually what has happened in a lot of major elements of development over time. She starts with a debate between Piaget and Chomsky, and begins with discussion, yes, humans are biological systems. Obviously, Airenti is very much humans are biological systems. She's not super into this paper. Kind of slants towards embodiment very strongly, in a biological sense, and the genetic endowment, nature of learning, all these things here. This is kind of our background. So, Piaget versus Chomsky. There's a well-known debate, as many of us probably know, about language acquisition and how how this debate played out. Piaget was influenced by Baldwin, who was a little bit more interaction heavy. Piaget updated his own theory, and there's an allusion to, on the developmental side, it's been proposed that Piaget's theory might be replaced as a meta theory for cognitive development by evolutionary psychology itself, which again is pretty, a very particular take on representations. And she cites, Airenti cites Piaget versus Chomsky as an example of the impossibility of dialogue. And I assume she means this kind of, that has been in the past, not necessarily that will always be in the future, but as a past example of impossibility of dialogue between these two, huge figures in these sort of adjacent fields. Piaget wasn't really able to justify his take on grammar rules and how they could be accounted for by century murderous schemata. And so maybe Chomsky won the debate. At the time, Chomsky was also trying to deal with things with a very particular way of addressing or not addressing learning. But some of his efforts for universal grammar maybe weren't fully realized yet, as she said, let's say. And so what's she taking away from this debate in a longer sense about development is, what's striking about the debate itself is that the biological model Piaget adopted was not the only point of disagreement. What was questioned in general was the relevance of development for the study of basic human abilities such as language itself. And going on, she more explicitly states, objections from cognitive scientists who did not admit the relevance of investigating development for the study of the human mind. So the short version of this is essentially, even at the outset with Piaget, who was very much developmentally oriented, there was sort of a lack of focus on early childhood development. How do we really do that in a way that actually works? And obviously Piaget was very focused on his children and observations from them, but she says that maybe there could have been more, there was more to be done about that. Particularly in this case, with what she calls interactionism, and how Piaget was very kind of rigid in his approach, and there's a critique here about how inverts in young children were considered essentially closed off, and there wasn't enough focus on social aspects of environment and so on. And there's been these criticisms below, and I'm going to kind of keep moving because I'm a little worried about time. But eventually we get to Bruner, who is, maturation of cognitive structures, and he kind of agreed with Chomsky, but then not so much, and went on his own views, and basically said Airenti basically points him out as a revolution in developmental studies, which more carefully, I think, should be scrutinized, but which more scrutiny and more sophisticated experimentation led to the discovery that children begin to engage in rather complex cognitive activity very early on. So what she's going with this is, like, we have to find ways to look at actual early infant childhood development to get some sense of where that's going. And I wanted to actually reference here, like, Joshua Tenenbaum's, Childless Hacker paper, but I couldn't, I'm not going to pull that up right now, I don't have time for that. But she gets into the problems of method, which is like, there are obvious reasons we don't do a whole bunch of experiments on kids and babies in ways that maybe would be most directly interesting. But we're kind of limited by our experimental approaches. We have to use observation, but observation isn't scientific, so how do we find ways to do this? And so developmental psychologists have used many different things to do that. And here's a big survey of them from there were fundamental advantages with techniques permitting to assess infants and young children's abilities in experiments, looking time, language studies and non-nurturative sucking, preferential looking or reaching, or social I forgot the last word. So there's a term for it, social referencing, I think, and the checking issue, and then some EEG recordings, and then also I think Avery may get to this a little bit later, but core knowledge and kind of these things leading to new trends and looking at how core knowledge could be developing over time. So to continue on with that, how do we? She's trying to offer some ideas and perspectives about how to get methodology that will allow us to look at things like core knowledge, or how is social cognition developed. And there's still debates about it because how do we get to some of these issues? How do we get to the issues of beliefs, false beliefs, and moralities? How do we get to look at core knowledge? How do we get to look at it from there's debate about high-level cognitive capacities as biologically predetermined that are constructed in interaction with the environment versus development doesn't exist in the social environment but is constrained by a number of basic competencies. So core knowledge of core systems. How do we get to flesh these out, and how do we get to see these developing over time? And she talks about the works of Tomasello. And his aims for creating evolutionarily informed account of ontogeny or uniquely human psychology. But he's also saying how, right now it's kind of trying to get some comparative facts and some speculations and trying to find ways to more and more ground this out and flesh it out. But there's also criticism with what it's able to do because, some of it's done in a lab environment. And the lab environment is the same as the natural environment. There's a lot of debate about can you have naturalistic experience within a lab setting. He responds to criticisms about, sometimes you can make an environment seem more natural than others to get more natural effects if you raise them in a human environment, and so on and so forth. So methodologically speaking, it's a tough situation because the validity and correct application is heavily debated, and how do we get to some ways of getting to the ground truth? Yes, or even monitoring it in an objective way. And it basically says we have to keep pushing for different lenses and different points of view because that's the best we can do. Is essentially her takeaway. And she does mention the theory of mind as an interesting example because there's a lot of focus on this over different periods of time. Different ages, different species even, and maybe this is an example for how we can get a lot of important viewpoints on the table for development. Finally, her last section is computational models of development, and she is a bit critical of this in the sense that purely computational views may not consider the physical and social context which development unfolds. If you're doing a pure simulation, it's hard to model all that, perhaps. But she does note there's maybe some versions of it, like the representational redescription work by Kimmel Smith, and maybe mapping some advanced in connectionist models as well. But there's still this critique of not simply task-specific learning. And how do we get to deriving previously acquired knowledge in transfer learning, generative models? How do we get to test that? And computation can help, but maybe only so much. And her she's alluding to the ways forward that reveal with the development of developmental robotics as maybe one of the best ways to get a simulation, not just arbitrary computer models, but developmental robotics that have to deal with more embodiment, more learning, and she's basically referencing this interest as it has been developed. This approach led to a comparison results in experiments with robots and children. It's a promising field, even if it does not overcome the problems described above regarding specificity of tasks that do not account for infants' ability to utilize previously differently acquired knowledge in the performance of a given task. And again, this I would cite, I don't have it here, but the A-Life in general and the International Workshop on Embodied Intelligence, these are some really great points that came up there. We did some presentations there as well. And in conclusion, she basically says how cognitive science, there's a usefulness in studying children to understand the mechanism of development, and developmental robotics is kind of maybe the best ground to really flesh that out in much more intricate ways than what we can do with children and stuff. So just kind of pro-developmental robotics as the solution. And just kind of a nod to state-of-the-art AI and mapping some of the trajectories here. Like you can see from Josh Bongar's work, Daniel Polani, actually someone I met at the Embodied Intelligence Workshop, and we had a ongoing discussion. So it'd be really cool, just as if you want to find out more about this stuff, maybe check out finding some of the researchers here and seeing what their trajectories of citations and even papers and references have been. So just a nod to that. And then her general closing remarks are, in the search for a unifying methodology, namely computer modeling as a guarantee of scientific results. And maybe that didn't really work out too well. But it's also important to understand why that directed a lot of effort earlier on in life, earlier on in the history of cognitive science and when it was at the time. And she's kind of saying, yeah, there's been progress again when we were able to kind of reconnect with the adult and child studies and kind of seeing transition points between them, and how studying the human mind means studying how the human mind changes interaction with the external environment all life long. And I personally agree with that point a lot. Like, there has to be a holistic view, and finding out how to do it's difficult, but she's kind of describing how the evolution of cognitive science, that essentially, this is one of the interesting trends in that process. Experimental studies do not completely replace other methodologies, but to rather coexist with them. And again, kind of a progressive and integrative view of all that. So that's kind of her take on things. And just a slight bonus round, we won't get into these, but just to mention these fairly quickly. One of the things that I didn't really mention here, but the way that cognitive science and linguistics have been funded in relation to AI is really interesting to think about. There was a really great slide that I couldn't find from, I think ICLR, or I think it was ICLR last year, but just how there are sort of different winters and summers for cognitive science and linguistics and AI, and how the funding influenced all those things. And how now, in this current era, there's a big focus on artificial neural networks, machine learning, the rise of big data, and investments that have kept big data being very relevant for its connectionist approach for many things. You've got to have your deep learning models for everything. But also as deep learning cresting slowly, and then finally an allusion to more robust AI, hybrid models, neurosymbolic models. Gary Marcus, a lot of this, and some other things that will be coming up in Avery's talk as well. And yeah, a reference to some work with Levin, Josh Bungard, and Xenobot on the left side, and then Neurosymbolic AI, the third wave with Louis Lem. Just some notes for that. And we'll make our full references available later, but that's all for now. Let's move on. Okay, one moment while I get the next thing. I'll quickly go over the neurodiversity talk, and then give it to Avery to round things out here. Thank you for staying with us. So about the neurodiversity talk, this wasn't my main specialty, but I just wanted to show this really quickly. It's a bit of a placeholder. Whoops, I'm not going to share that. I'm already sharing it. Great, I'm sharing it with you. Thank you for being here, sharing together. We wanted to have a little bit more of an in-depth talk about this, but we didn't quite get the time, and one of the people working this couldn't really be here today. So just as a mention and a nod to neurodiversity, there's a really cool book out, A New Critical Paradigm, edited by Hannah Butterstelt-Roquist. Nick Chown and Anna Stenning, and I'm sure I didn't say any of those names right. But there's also a nice review by Julie Din that I'm just going to really quickly go over. Disability Studies Quarterly, which is quite an interesting a journal about disabilities and how neurodiversity fits into that. So Julie Din is reviewing this book here. And just some points I wanted to mention from it was the concept of neuroqueering, which essentially has to do with practices intended to undo one's cultural conditioning towards conformity and compliance with dominant norms, with the aim of reclaiming one's capacity to give more full expression to one's neurodivergence or one's uniquely weird potential and inclinations. And so Din kind of addresses neuroqueering, and she has some critiques of it and what they're trying to do with this book. She also mentions neurodiversity studies in general, and she describes it as is it an engagement that's primarily methodological rather than substantive? And methodology is important, but she's saying, is it really enough is it substantial enough? The volume would have benefited from more sustained and explicit engagement with the question of race and queerness, she believes. Those are Din's thoughts. Another interesting concept was neurodivergent well-being, and how the essay in Chapman's essay, Neurodiversity, Disability, and Well-being, successfully challenges the vision of neurodivergence as an inherently pathological, tragic, and at odds with living the good life, promulgated by the medical model. And so there's some critiques of how, you're medically neurodivergent. Medically speaking, that's a problem. And Din finds his argument to be pretty good. And she celebrates his use of the value-neutral model. And Chapman is able to argue that neurodivergence itself cannot be equated with lesser well-being. Whoops, I skipped some slides here, but lesser well-being, or that it's a good critique. She believes it's a good critique of the idea that neurodivergent individuals are necessarily worse off. And again, going really quickly through all of this stuff, I apologize, but interesting branch between neurodiversity and activism, which many of us here I'm sure know very well. The Interactive Framework for Investigating Autism in Social Institutions. Din likes this particular essay where Jurgens basically uses an active framework and explains how it's actually a great way to be exploring neurodiversity and understanding that there's a tremendous amount of importance looking at the way the environment shapes perceptions of neurodiversity and lived experience of it as well, and how it allows us to escape a purely biological explanation for autism and neurodivergence. So this is just a super quick preview of the book and the review itself. Thank you very much for bearing with me about that. If you have questions or references or ideas, please put them in the chat or save them until we're almost open to question time ahead. So just a moment on that, but we'd love to hear your feedback about that. So that's all for me. Are you still there, Avery?
Yes, I am, and I will try to keep my section pretty brief, given the time constraints we have.
Are you able to share your screen here?
I think so. I'm looking for the option. Share.
In the toolbar, it's 1, 2, 3. It's the third one from the left.
Oh, okay.
On the bottom. And then you can pick which window or tab or whatever.
So I will be going over some to continue off of what Jesse and Bradley have explained. I'll be explaining some interesting combinations of developmental psychobiology with different concepts and fields that are relevant for cognitive science. for the sake of brevity, I'll try to quickly go over each slide. So the slides kind of build up in the concepts of building. So a sensitive period is a period in which an organism is of maturation, in which an organism is especially reactive to particular stimuli, and a critical period is a subset of sensitive periods in which that reaction to that stimuli must be normal functioning. And I have a bunch of different articles here that each explore it from an interesting perspective. It impacts a broad variety of phenomena, including sexual differentiation. This article is interesting in that they argue that shyness follows a particular developmental timeline, and it goes into it describes a lot about how within that timeline it shows that a particular kind of shyness, social self-awareness, is neotenous, which I think is interesting in that there's a general, as this author explains, Lund explains, there's a general interesting argument about why neoteny, which is the retaining of juvenile features into adulthood, is evolutionary useful, and I think that would be compatible with a lot of different computational and evolutionary models. Yeah, it can even affect aggression, as shown here when prenatal testosterone is measured, and there have been attempts to model sensitive periods, which would again be useful and accessible for integrating potentially into different cognitive models, computational cognitive models. To continue onwards, so Knudsen talks about how sensitive periods talks about a sort of stability, in his words, a stability landscape, which is when a neural circuit is shaped by the input within a critical or sensitive period to create specific preferences in the organism for information processing, which I'll return back to later. And Samantha elaborates on their research into exploring invariant object recognition, which is just the ability to recognize an object in different angles in baby chicks. So they an interesting takeaway there that returns back to critical period is the idea that that these baby chicks that they were able to, that compared to other studies, giving more abnormal stimuli, which was specifically angled, very limited viewing angles, and just going between 15% angles rather than fluid turning, limited the ability of the chicks to recognize the objects they were imprinted to. And finally, to return back to what Jesse said about neurosymbolic systems and computational models in general, there's interesting intersections that kind of offer what Jesse was talking about as an integrated model of cognition that's informed by development, in that this isn't a direct link. Inala and Yang et al. explore a neurosymbolic transformer that seeks to limit communication between agent and cooperative tasks, which is, I think, analogous to the sort of critical periods we have about aggression and other communication strategies, which Treisman explores here. These finally, Kokaran, Pizzulo, and Howery talk about allostasis and allostatic agents, which is simply strategies and physiology that encourages effective homeostasis. And they talk about how they give a model of cognition as a sort of prediction and uncertainty resolving generative model, which I think would be a compatible lens to describe many of the sort of behaviors that are determined by critical periods. And I think there are many different. I think predictive modeling is sort of very trendy now, and I think putting development into that seems like a interesting next step. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to open up the call for a general discussion now.
Yeah, thank you, Avery, for all that. I guess we don't have that much time left. So if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to do that. But we can also get started on our discussion. A lot of things came up in that, from Bradley's talk about kind of a high-level overview of how things in a field of study can evolve, and then I kind of went in depth about the concept of development in sort of cognitive science and psychology in general, in specific, and those are some interesting open-ended questions about future possibilities of what Avery said. So anyone has any questions, they can mention them or write them in the chat as well. Oops, that's wrong.
Yeah, so perhaps we could motivate this a bit. I noticed that there were a lot of connections between what I talked about, and then Jesse kind of gave a lot of detail about some of these things that I pointed out in my talk. So, for example, you have these debates surrounding different sort of dualist perspectives, and what I mean by that is like, nature, nurture, or, in some cases you have like different views, like embodied versus disembodied, or things like that. And so the question is can you boil, maybe you can boil them down to these oppositions, these different camps. Maybe they're a little bit more subtle. And so I think it's interesting that we pay attention to these kind of debates as like a way to look at like how the field evolves, and I think that's a key element.
Yeah, and even like in development, in the concept of development, it's sort of it's really interesting to look. I think it's so important to look at the evolution of trajectories in the field of studies from both like just a theoretical perspective, and there's theory, but then there's also very specific things that influence whether or not a theory is adopted, or like maybe you don't want to disagree with a big name like Chomsky, or maybe you do, or like I forgot who wrote the critique, but I think it was Minsky, his particular perceptron, and how that affected in the 80s with AI. It's like, oh well, we've really got to focus on symbolic logic and symbolic aspects of programming, and not so much connectionist models, and how those things can shape whole generations of research at times. Oh, we have a question here.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's Arima. She says, if we were to come away from this dualism, which philosophers underpin a trajectory that doesn't follow social robotics, or i.e. non-Kantian? Anyone have any thoughts about that? Do you have any thoughts about that, Arima?
I mean, so I'm a neuroscientist by background that has that Kantian aspect to it, but I work from arts and humanities now, so I'm trying to understand more of these things from it's really useful to have this introduction to see kind of where things are. But yeah, I was thinking like kind of post-humanism, people like Braidotti, who's Italian philosopher. So kind of thinking, embracing that there is the possibility of artificial intelligence, but that's in dialogue with kind of indigenous scholarship. We heard a bit about neurodiversity there, and I like the bit that was coming at these different perspectives or perspectivism. So how do we think about that in terms of a different philosophy that's not the mind-body split? So I just wondered if there's any philosophers that I'm not aware of that is in your field that brings a different conversation.
If you want to explore a cognitive science book that goes deeply into how the mind-body split is a false dichotomy, I'd recommend The Embodied Mind by Varela. I believe he also mentions how many different authors in phenomenology, such as Merleau-Ponty, offered ideas that, if taken just a little bit further, would be compatible as formalization of a lot of ways of explaining away mind-body dualism and alternative ways of framing the sort of interactions we have as agents.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And then does it extend to a more an idea that the mind is outside of the body?
I would also mention, and I think Avery can speak to this pretty well too, but like kind of another step along the line of research from embodiment would be Tony Chamero or Anthony Chamero. And I never say the last name right, but I put it in the chat. But he's someone behind the concept of he's a proponent of radical embodied cognition, which really dives into he doesn't believe it's the only thing that works. I don't believe he thinks everything is only ever radically embodied. And by radical embodiment, he means very, very, very little representation, very heavy reliance on affordances or direct perception of what can be done in a situation. And I don't think he proposes this as the end all, the be all, but I would assume that he looks at how there's very specific things that the mind and the body does, which is almost sort of structural in terms of, almost sort of structural in terms of how an agent is interacting with the embodiment itself. And there was something that you, Arima, said at the very end of your last audio, and I didn't quite hear it. Could you say the last thing you said again?
Oh gosh, I don't think I can remember. I guess more this collectivism. So kind of, if we're thinking, I guess we'd call it sort of, from where I am, new materialism. Have you heard of new materialism?
I'm not sure, but I'd be happy if you.
So just thinking that everything is matter, and therefore it's kind of energy, and so those separations are not, they don't exist. So people like Karen Barad, who's a physicist turned philosopher, coming from a kind of queer perspective, and she, they're kind of looking at this, the multitudes of possibilities of thought and material and matter, and so then kind of everything is dissolved away from itself in the sense of it's just energy. And so thinking about consciousness in that way as well. So I just wondered whether these kind of thinking from these philosophers had crossed over into cognitive science at all.
Do you have anything you want to say about
The only thing I can think of is maybe the free energy. What do you call it? The free energy principle. I'm not entirely sure because I don't entirely grasp what you said about new materialism, but I could kind of see it intersecting in interesting ways with. I don't fully understand it, but free energy principle is something that I've heard a lot, decent amount about. It's basic. It sort of explains. It sort of explains life and cognition as to really simplify it, given that I barely understand it, probably don't understand it, minimize the free energy of the system. So it's sort of
I don't know if you want to
changing the world into a sort of coherent state that matches their internal state of the system, something along those lines. I'm not sure how much that lines up with what you were saying about things being able, like a physics-based perspective, from what sounds like a physics-based perspective, where you want to break things down radically into a system.
I'm not sure if Bradley. I don't know if Bradley wants to say something about that, or.
Yeah, I didn't really have anything to say. I was just following along. Yeah.
And I know we don't have that much time, but I would follow up on the free energy principle by saying to kind of think about what Varela was saying is I think, and I'm not trying to speak for the free energy principle itself, but I think there is an interesting set of people looking at. You may want to look at things also like. There's been various levels of looking at things like information metabolism, or metabolism in how information is processed, or different processing information. And I think a lot of ways the free energy principle is sort of, it is kind of derived from some physics related stuff, but also just understanding, I would also give a nod to cybernetics in general, and its nature of regulation, and how, cybernetics is a very sort of old anachronistic term that nobody really uses anymore. And it's kind of like, it's now modern day control theory and some communication Spanish related stuff. You may know it, may not. But like, it's a bit, what I would say about cybernetics and the free energy principle and some of the metabolism stuff is that I think there's and kind of something that Avery alluded to and made it explicitly state is how a really interesting way of thinking about all these things are, how do systems regulate either in a physics sense or not? What are the principles at play that cause a system to regulate its behavior or actions therein? The free energy principle is a bit like an attempt at, you could say, minimizing surprise, or in a kind of classical cybernetic sense, it's maybe a sense of how minimizing the variance between your model of the world or the situation and moving towards less and less surprise or variance to that, and the nature in which that happens. And the free energy principle itself isn't, you can't really test it because it's a principle, but you can see whether or not the principle holds in different situations. And a long time ago, I presented a paper in the lab about how gradient descent kind of fits with the free energy principle, and how like these different ways of things interacting with each other maybe fit certain principles of maybe physics, or there may be some overarching ways in which energy or states, or at least information flows through different states, and certain regulatory patterns that emerge from those flows, or things like that. I mean,
That's super interesting. Thank you so much. Just one thing to add on the artificial intelligence front. I wondered how much do you go into mathematics and kind of Fibonacci numbers, patterns in nature on the evolutionary side of things at all? Does that feature?
Like, do I personally, or do like other
just
people?
like kind of just generally in cognitive science? To what extent? I mean, to what extent does artificial intelligence kind of go into Turing's work in Fibonacci numbers, and is this something that's still is it part of the field? Is it considered, or is it something kind of on another side?
I think it'd be kind of fringe, but I could see it being brought up in like artificial life. I could see it being brought up in like emergence and self-organizing systems.
Okay, that's interesting.
But I wouldn't think like mainstream CogSci is focused on that. But I could from what I vaguely remember Fibonacci numbers, I think it could be brought up in those.
There was one challenge I was working on that extended from Turing's work on Fibonacci numbers to find non-Fibonacci numbers. So that there was this problem that was being discussed about how do you look at what's being modelled versus what kind of exists in reality, and that challenge between lived experience versus the model. And Turing was looking for non-Fibonacci numbers, and I found one that had a pattern of a sunflower, perfect pattern of a sunflower, but non-Fibonacci numbers, which I think he was trying to then go back into this Devo evolutionary perspective, patterns in nature, but he also worked on the brain. So I just wondered if there was anything that people had started to pick up around Turing's work just before he died that could go back into cognitive science from thinking about this biological, mathematical problem.
A few things come to mind. One of them is that I don't know if it's the Fibonacci numbers, and correct me if you might remember this, Bradley, but someone was saying how, like, this is at NeurIPS last year, I think, and about how, like, in a very early video game, they had to find a way to do some generative models of different worlds, like kind of Alien Invaders type stuff. And I think they were explaining how they used essentially that sequence or another sequence like that to save space, because they have very limited space in those things, but they use a sort of sequence like that as a means to simplify generative models. So that would be a way to look at some of those kind of things. And not just like in art, not just like in video games, but like I think to kind of modernize it a bit, I think a bit about like neurosymbolic stuff and a lot of the hybrid models that are coming out now, which is, how do we get to combining some elements of potentially generative things, some elements of here's a sequence that we know, like a strict sequence of Fibonacci numbers, or how to differentiate them, and also things like advances in deep learning, which I feel like I'm just saying a whole bunch of like general topics there, but it's like I think to directly answer the thing about Turing and some of his earlier work, I do think there's room for it. It's just kind of like I'm almost a little bit more familiar with like the AI version of things in cognitive science right now, but it's sort of like there's an understanding of a need for some, like I think a lot of things like Turing and even Norbert Wiener and some early cybernetics, there's a lot of stuff there that really hasn't been fleshed out, or even like I don't know if you know Stephen Grossberg.
No.
Like he recently published a book that I happen to be colleagues with some of the people that were in his department a long time ago, and how they went through. He basically founded a department in Boston, and a lot of the students there are coming together to look at his book again. And what they're finding is a lot of ideas that. There are many ideas, and I would associate terms with these in some of the way you're talking about. There are a lot of ideas from the past that just aren't really. It's sort of a difficult thing because they're somewhat dated in their origins, and that finding new ways to integrate those vibrant concepts that haven't really been put into computational models yet. There's a lot of difficulty about that, but there's also a lot of fruit therein. And I think, if anything, like kind of what I would hope from frontier mapping and the computer stuff in general is like, we do want to point out those things and find a way to point out, hey, here's some stuff that was really popular a long time ago, but it's kind of fallen out of fashion. Is there anything we can do with them again? So I don't have a clear answer about that, but I think those are exactly the things that kind of we should be looking for. A bit like Indiana Jones looking for lost treasure stuff, and then can we repurpose that more?
I would add that, yeah, I mean, things that may have perfectly good applicability in CogSci might not be something that they do in that community. So, like the A-Life community, as Avery mentioned, they'll do stuff like create simulations with Fibonacci spirals to make like little, plant growth patterns, and you might be able to submit that to a conference in A-Life and then get it accepted, and but maybe a cognitive scientist doesn't necessarily see the immediate relevance of that, and then maybe at some point they'll find, someone will incorporate it into something that's maybe more palatable to that audience, like some sort of network model or something, something that then people can see the relevance of it, and they say, oh yeah, that's really interesting. We'll put that into our conference or into our journal. And so, that's one of the constraints too, is like, what does the community view as sort of relevant to what people are thinking at the time? And so things might be high, and I've had this problem with my own work. Like, I'll, have a topic and it'll be something that maybe is a little bit outside the mainstream, but you have to find the right place to submit it. And you would be surprised, if you go to one community versus another, how things are differentially received. And so that's another thing to think about, is that the ideas it isn't necessarily the ideas, it's sort of the social milieu that have to accept them or talk about them.
The embodiment of ideas is something you have to consider. It's not just the idea, it's the environment.
Exactly, and how an idea travels and how our disciplines kind of prevent that traveling. So this is a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Christopher.
Yeah, I'm at the point in my career where I'm almost done with undergrad, but I'm really interdisciplinary, really interested, and I could go in like 20 different directions. I think interdisciplinary research questions are particularly interesting nowadays, but there's not the space for them.
Yeah, that's just a big thing of like, even in graduate school or finding funding for research afterwards or doing like industry or prepared academic work is like, you kind of have to show yourself as, oh, I'm aligned with this established discipline, but then a lot of the cool, like a lot of the cool stuff, like if you look like Michael Levin, like he has his hand in so many things, and he's able to kind of bridge a lot of these interdisciplinary gaps. But it's like, I think a lot of people would love to do that, but just the opportunity and funding and the ways to do it are a little bit constrained. So, that's kind of that's the implicit political like funding commentary that's here. But there are ways to do it, and I think that's kind of the good fight anyway, to fight that fight.
I mean, one tip just from me on that is that I work with artists who are interested in the brain and the mind, and they ask me questions, and I'm like, I don't know the answer to that, you know, and that sends me in a direction to go, okay, well, what? I could go and find this. So then we start a new dialogue about what they're interested in.
That would have been me in alternative universe. I used to be a fine arts major who's interested in this stuff, and I switched majors.
I wish I was here because he's another member of our lab who's doing like computational stuff and like some machine learning things with artists who do neuroscience stuff. I think that's one of his like side things he's been into. So I mean, I think you can speak a lot to that and like have some actual experience. So I definitely agree with that. I see the value of that. Oops. Sorry, I have a phone call here.
Okay, yeah. So did Christopher have a comment? I think it was resolved, or did you have something else you wanted to bring up? He's in the chat. Christopher said, yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was still getting used to the user.
Okay, yeah.
Trying to mute myself. Yeah, no, I just kind of want to be a fly on the wall, but I think a lot of my questions that I actually came into this talk was very good the whole way through, but was it Rima? I kind of came into the conversation, or was listening to the conversation kind of coming from the same perspective. And some of the suggestions of where to look, like Tony Jamero, look interesting. So I think most of my questions got answered. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think Tony has a new book out, or a new
edition. New edition of the phenomenology textbook.
Yeah, he's interested in like phenomenology and very much like radical embodied cognition and how a lot of the like sensory motor experience relates to consciousness and experiential things. So between that, if you're into hardcore like neuroscience or consciousness studies, I'd also recommend Megan Peters she's in UC Irving, University of California, Irving. Megan Peters. She does a lot of that, and these are all from Neuromatch, Neuromatch Academy and Neuromatch conferences. But also Conrad Cording is interested in causality a lot, which is kind of adjacent. But put their name in there too.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. Any other? I know we're kind of pushing the limit of things here, but anybody else have any questions or things they want to say?
It's a personal thing. I already have Arima's contact, but if you're going to explore Anthony Chamero's stuff, I also want to get back into it. So if you would like to share a contact, if you're going to go into it, I'd love to chat about it.
You?
Yeah, what would be the best? I just leave an email in the chat, or
that works for me. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So one last question from me while I've got you. What about extended consciousness? Are people doing stuff on that? So kind of, or extended perception, augmented reality? How much does that kind of hit the field?
I think Bradley might have something to say about that. I have interest in it, but I don't know as much.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, judging from the conference here, I haven't seen very much in the conference on like augmented reality, and then there's a extended cognition. There's specialized conferences for that. And also if you go to the Human Computer Interaction Conference, there's a lot of things on that, not as much on sort of like the philosophy of it, but more like applications. So this is a good example of where, depending on the venue, you have these different perspectives, and then people, things are driven by like, if you can build an application, or, if you're in a community where you're focused on philosophy, if, there's a more of an emphasis on philosophy, or, people don't, or if you're in experimental psychology, then can you do an experiment? So even, depending on where you are, those sort of different considerations are there, and it's kind of resulted in this sort of drift of, people doing augmented reality stuff, but they're doing different things with it. So it's like, there's some unification that if you're a person who's just entering the area and you want to know, what's going on, you get these like different groups of people, and I think there's a lot of promise in like bringing those things together. Like I'm always a big fan of synthesis, so bringing things together from a lot of different perspectives, I think, has a lot of value. Taking what one community's doing.
That's funny because.
What was that?
I said that's funny because that's almost exactly what my company focuses on, is using AI, AR and virtual reality to kind of look at the environment, kind of look for a more embodied perspective. It's tricky though.
Yeah.
It's tricky though, yeah, very, very tricky. Yeah.
That sounds really interesting.
I'm definitely interested in that. I'll reach out to you later or something about
Perfect,
that.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, what I would like to do, and I haven't had time yet, but I have a new research position elsewhere that's looking a lot at like interpretation of biometric data and acquiring biometric data and all these like inflows for like these inputs and how they're happening, and that's a cool thing to be looking at more. But also, like, I think that if I was to add on to like Airenti's paper about developmental stuff and social robotics as like a great place to study things, I think the next version of that, particularly for like actual human level stuff, would be AR and virtual reality and being able to measure things in those environments, because at least you'd have a different. It's sort of it's stimulated, but you could still have some. I don't know. I just think that's going to be kind of the next frontier for a lot of those things, and
Definitely, I completely agree with you. What was interesting about what you said in the Airenti's paper about robotics, that was really interesting. So part of the problem with AR and virtual reality, there's still like a mismatch from what you've experienced over time in your life and what you're seeing. You're still having to do that swap. As an example, we had some people who were paratroopers using a display, and they experience a lot more motion sickness than someone who, has kind of looked at their computer screen most of their life, So because they're more familiar with what it's like to be falling out of the sky. So when they see like a simulation of that, their body fights it, and they actually feel more sick, and they actually have to take a nap, and before the everything kind of resets. So. Yeah, robotics. Yeah, really interesting.
That's very like. I think there's gonna be. I want to get into that space ultimately, so I feel you, and I think that's a very interesting stuff. I think Aaron asked about open data.
Sorry, I've got so many things on the go, but basically I'm trying to bring all these things together. So I just wondered about the open data and kind of climate modeling, and anyone who's working on that kind of stuff that links into extended reality, augmented reality. Anyone working on that? I work with environmental scientists basically, so I want to do interesting things with their data.
I know Bradley's done a bunch of stuff with open data in general.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anyone who fits that bill exactly, but there's always room for experimentation, and so yeah, I think it's probably a frontier area where no one's really established anything that I know of. So we'll see.
I think you could probably get there's probably some artist who's doing visualizations, interactive. Installations, probably some interesting machine learning visualization stuff with it. I think that'd be interesting.
kind of collective intelligence, you know, thinking about biodiversity. We've got coronavirus, you know, all these different forms of data kind of coming together. I think there's a really interesting opportunity.
There's some, I can't quite remember who, but if I think about it, I'll try to send it to you, because there was something, it was a few years ago at one of my first conferences I went to. There's someone who was looking really at extended consciousness and kind of collective information processing, but I don't know the details right now.
Well, thanks. This has been a really super rich. I'm all excited because I've got research leave next year. Yay! And so I'm just like diving into different disciplines to see what's going on.
Yeah.
My pet esoteric interest that isn't very marketable to universities is probably like combining almost Jungian stuff with a lot of what I talked about today. I think it'd be interesting to create frameworks that talk about because I guess what really interests me, and at first I don't see more conversation about it, is that it's really easy to divide archetypes into developmental stages and even gender scale stuff, and I'm frustrated that no one else, well, I'm not going to say no one else, but it doesn't seem to be like a particularly, I haven't found, there's one person who might be, I need to look more into his stuff, but I haven't found people who are taking that approach. I'm actually...
And just do it, just go there. In my head, there's like, what is gender? What is that even?
There's actually like a major interest of mine right now.
Yeah, follow it. Sounds great.
Computational models of sex-driven psychological and social behavior, which isn't gender, but you can apply that to animals more easily, and I think it's like a proto-gender.
And then the next thing is going beyond speciesism. Like what if we rethink the whole species? You know, non-coding DNA, all that kind of stuff. There's so much interesting opportunities out there.
Wait, non-what DNA?
Basically, in biology, you know, like if you think about the way the human genome and the genome, and you've got letters that code it, there's also non-coding areas. And I think if not Crick and Watson, but Rosalind Franklin, who's looking at it from a chemistry perspective, crystallography, that's a whole different take on what a genome is, and takes the kind of the language of coding of genes into a completely different direction. Which, you know, I think there's probably some kind of linguistic thing that could be brought to bear in kind of rethinking biology by not having that kind of traditional genetic knowledge that comes from Crick and Watson, to relook at all of these things from a non-universalistic perspective, to go to the pluriversal.
Did you mention like a contemporary researcher in genetics?
Oh my goodness, I'm so out of date with the field of genetics, but I'm obsessed with that moment when Crick and Watson took it in one direction and Rosalind Franklin possibly could have taken it into another. But we're kind of, I mean, I guess the people to look at would be the people who are, if you just look up non-coding DNA, you'll bring up an array of researchers and see, you know, even some of the discoveries that we've had more recently. They're in that area, but it also links to things like stress. And so, you know, things that happen in your life and trauma that then has a physiological impact, but it's not coded in your genes at all. But people think, oh, let's look at these things. But actually, you have to unhook it from that and think, what's your life events? Which, of course, it links to learning and cognitive development as well.
Like epigenetics, right?
Yeah, so look up epigenetics, essentially. But to get
if you would like
get into
4E cognition, it's a contemporary, I guess, movement goal shared standard that has an approach that has an interest in cognition also being defined as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, which would be in line with a lot of what you mentioned you're interested in. It's a pretty mainstream approach that has a lot of interest in cognitive science now.
Yeah, it's one of the more like recent. It's pretty much mainstream now, where like we talked about Varela, and Varela kind of came about in 91 or whatever, and that was sort of the dawn of more acceptance of embodiment, and there's like embodiment and an activism, which I believe Peoples talks about there, and kind of one of the as a slight tangent, one of the things that I didn't talk about today was a somewhat famous or infamous paper called "What Happened to Cognitive Science" by Nunez and other people et al. And it was sort of a critique of where did the field go, and as much as the developmental lens that I used today was a bit of a hey, here's what happened with development and some ways forward for it. One of the critiques that Nunez brought up was sort of like, did cognitive science ever really get beyond psychology basically, and it's sort of computational endeavors with making some, like what I talked about at the beginning of the talk today. And why I mention this here is because yes, now it's a bit more mainstream to have the Fourier approach that doesn't deal with embodiment and activism and all that. But there's still some tremendous rifts in the community in general, and the way in which if you want to pursue things forward, like you said, it's really just kind of, it's a bit of just doing it, and then like Bradley said, kind of matching. Hey, here's some people who will find this relevant, or at least tangentially fit their interest and establish funding or established inertia enough that they can find some salience in building that way. But it's important to have these viewpoints available. On that note, I think I'm gonna have to step out. I have to go take care of some other things soon. So I think if Avery has your contacts, then I'll get in touch with you both either. I'll put my other thing in the chat, my email in the chat. I don't think I was the best. I'm also on like Twitter at my name, but use this one. Yeah, it's really great to see everybody today, and thanks for sticking around at the end, because I know we took a long time and all that stuff. So yeah, thank you. You guys can feel free to talk. I think if I leave, it won't close the room.
No, I think, I have to leave as well, but if you want to, the room will stay open as long as someone's in here, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to go. It's like 11 o'clock in the UK, but it's a really great chat.
Actually,
I'm actually in the UK until December, and a long story. So
well, Avery and I were in the UK for research grants, and I had to come back sooner, but they're going to be there for later, so maybe you guys can.
I'm in Blackpool of all places.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Just saying thanks. Good stuff. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I should head off too. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.